decide to get serious, there's only one place to come. The games of Super Nintendo.
In 1993, the North American console wars were in full swing, with the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis competing for the top spot in the market. Developers and manufacturers were hard at work to make the next great 16-bit games and accessories. But one company was stuck in the past: Camerica. Camerica thought it would be wiser to appeal to the more than 30 million consumers who already had an 8-bit Nintendo Entertainment System. So in 1993, they announced the Aladdin Deck Enhancer, a device you could plug into your NES and play special proprietary compact cartridges. Why? Because not only did the Aladdin promise additional memory and graphics power, but the cartridges were $30 to $40 less than a traditional NES cartridge. Never heard of it? That's no surprise. Camerica quickly went under after the product was announced in January of 1993. It's questionable if the Aladdin Deck Enhancer ever got a retail release, and it's mostly only known today in collector circles. So, let's take a look at the Aladdin Deck Enhancer, the company behind it all, and why it faded into obscurity. Camerica was founded as a giftware wholesaler in 1987 by David J. Harding. Based out of Ontario, Canada, Camerica sold items such as porcelain bears, pottery, and crystal glassware to gift shops, but they soon got into the fast-growing video game business. Their first products were wireless controllers for the Nintendo Entertainment System, such as the Freedom Stick and the Supersonic Joystick.
Set you free! No wires!
Camerica also made the Freedom Connection, which turned any controller into a wireless controller. They had a few wild ideas teased in magazines, including a portable Nintendo Entertainment System called the Nintendo Express, but they were never released. Camerica really hit it big in 1990 when they released the Game Genie, a device that allowed players to add and create cheat codes for their NES games. A video game company based out of the UK known as Codemasters developed the Game Genie. When founders Richard and David Darling went to Nintendo to inquire about licensing, they were turned away. So instead, they licensed the device to Camerica. To help with distribution outside of Canada, Camerica licensed the Game Genie to toy company Galoob, which would distribute the device throughout the United States and Europe. Nintendo quickly sued everyone involved to prevent the Game Genie from coming to market, but ultimately Nintendo lost the lawsuit. The Game Genie went on to sell more than 2.5 million units. It was so popular that Codemasters made versions for the Game Boy, Game Gear, Sega Genesis, and Super Nintendo. The Game Genie also helped establish a strong relationship between Camerica and Codemasters. The two companies formed an agreement where Camerica would essentially become the sales distribution arm for Codemasters products. Camerica decided to publish several of Codemasters' games as unlicensed Nintendo cartridges. The cartridges were either gold or silver, and each one had a switch on the back to get around the NES lockout chip. Depending on the version of NES hardware, players would set the switch to either A or B. The switch essentially crashed the NES lockout chip, allowing the games to play. They put out several titles, including Stunt Kids, Super Robin Hood, and The Fantastic Adventures of Dizzy. Camerica relied heavily on grassroots advertising. They would release titles to rental stores 30 days in advance so players could try the games out before buying them. They also advertised on the Home Shopping Network. HSN got 30-day exclusivity before the games hit stores. They even signed 1990 Nintendo World Champion Thor Ackerlund to an endorsement deal. Ackerlund promoted the games in magazines, commercials, and on the Home Shopping Network. Camerica games weren't sold at massive toy chains like Toys R Us, but they were widely available at department stores like Walmart, and smaller chains like Electronics Boutique and KB Toys. Camerica and Codemasters' unlicensed games sold relatively well, but the biggest problem was developer costs. Making unlicensed games was expensive and time-consuming, and the profit margins weren't great. Richard and David Darling of Codemasters thought there could be a better way, and they came up with the Aladdin Deck Enhancer. Traditional NES cartridges contain several components, including the game ROM chip and security chip. The problem was, every time a cartridge had to be made, every single component had to be included, making costs high. Codemasters took most of the chips and put them inside the Deck Enhancer. On the game cartridges was just the game ROM. Therefore, companies could develop games without having to pay for extra chips on every cartridge, which would make games significantly cheaper. Camerica thought the idea was brilliant and agreed to license and distribute the device. While a large portion of the gaming population was moving on to the 16-bit systems, there were more than 30 million NES systems already out there. In fact, many parents were upset that the 16-bit Super Nintendo wasn't backwards compatible with the NES and refused to upgrade.
I'm going to say no, and I'm going to explain to him how people market things to make you spend more money.
Camerica thought they could take advantage of the lack of new NES games by introducing the Aladdin with various budget titles. It could extend the life of the system. In 1992, at the Summer Consumer Electronics Show, Camerica teased their new product, which at the time was called the Aladdin System. A Swedish magazine, Nintendo Magasinet, seemed to like the idea, but also stated, "What Nintendo's lawyers have to say about this, we don't know." On January 7th, 1993, at the Winter Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas, Camerica unveiled their new device, the Aladdin Deck Enhancer, to the public. The Deck Enhancer itself would retail for $39.99 and come packaged with a game. Additional games would cost between $17.99 and $19.99. At the time, Camerica was only planning to release the Aladdin Deck Enhancer in North America. Camerica president David J. Harding boasted, "Our Aladdin Deck Enhancer is like a wish in hard times for families that have longed for quality video game entertainment at a recession-busting price." So, now that you know more about the history, let's talk about the actual device. Let's take a look at the packaging. The bottom right corner says the Deck Enhancer will upgrade your Nintendo Entertainment System. Oh, that's interesting. Upgrade it with what? According to the back, the Deck Enhancer has a 64K memory upgrade for better graphics and bigger games. But this is all just marketing hype. The Aladdin Deck Enhancer is no different than a standard Camerica cartridge. Inside the box is the Deck Enhancer with instructions, along with a Dizzy the Adventurer cartridge, and a poster manual for the game. Believe it or not, there are two versions of the Deck Enhancer. The first version has an A/B switch, just like their unlicensed games. This is to get around the NES lockout chip. Version 2 removed the switch as they found a way to automate the whole process. A word of caution, the Aladdin Deck Enhancer only works with the original toaster design of the Nintendo Entertainment System. If you try to use it on a top loader, it could potentially fry your system. It also needs the NES lockout chip to work, so it doesn't work with third-party consoles like the Retron or the Analog NT Mini. To use the device, just plug in a compact cartridge into the Deck Enhancer, then use it like you would any NES cartridge. They even come out to about the same size. So how about the games? The Aladdin Deck Enhancer only had 7 games, and besides the pack-in title, all of them had previously been released as a standalone cartridge. Camerica did tease future titles on the back of the box, but the company didn't last long enough to release any of them. We'll start with the pack-in title, Dizzy the Adventurer. This is a port of Dizzy, Prince of the Yoke Folk, which was released on several computer platforms, including the Commodore 64 and Amiga. Your goal is to rescue your girlfriend Daisy, who is locked away in a castle. The best way to describe this game is an adventure platformer. Rather than attack enemies, Dizzy must collect items and use them to solve puzzles. It's fun trying to figure out which items Dizzy needs to use to get around certain obstacles. You'll also get to interact with a bunch of different characters, including Dizzy's pet, Hoagie. The Dizzy games were made by the Oliver twins, a pair of developers who collaborated with Codemasters on many titles. They made a lot of Dizzy games. There are more than 15 titles in the franchise. But as far as Dizzy the Adventurer goes, it's a lot of fun. Once you beat it, it's not as exciting since you know what to do the second time around, but it's still one of my favorite games on the Aladdin Deck Enhancer. Next up is Micro Machines. Micro Machines is probably the most well-known game from Camerica, thanks to the popularity of the toy franchise. This is a top-down racer where you get to race with different Micro Machines in scaled-down racetracks, like in a bathtub or on a table. You also get to choose your racer, and it's me? As you win races, you'll add cars to your Micro Machines collection. This is another fun title on the Aladdin Deck Enhancer. We're 2 for 2 so far, but as I mentioned earlier, you can also buy this game as a standalone cartridge. Now let's look at Big Nose Freaks Out. This is a platformer where your goal is to collect all of your stolen bones. But instead of walking on 2 feet, Big Nose rolls around on a wheel. It almost feels like a Sonic game. Momentum plays a big role in making some jumps, and you can even launch off of ramps. Collecting power stones gives you a projectile you can fire, but once you get hit, you lose the power-up. Get hit again, and you're dead. Jumping on mushrooms reveals power-ups, but it can also cause problems. Sometimes it will cause a lightning storm, or even reverse your controls. Big Nose Freaks Out is a decent platformer, but can be a bit of a challenge. There's also no music in any of the levels, which was an odd choice. I found the prequel, Big Nose the Caveman, more enjoyable. Camerica was planning to release this on the Aladdin Deck Enhancer, but it never came out. Here we have 4 games in one with Quattro Sports. The 4-in-1 cartridges were unique to Camerica, and they marketed them heavily in their advertisements. Unfortunately, most of these games are poor. First up is Baseball Pros, featuring teams from around the world, including the Fightin' Bears of Moscow. This game is bogged down by issues. Fielding the ball is almost impossible. You can only control your pitcher in the infield, and you can't move your outfielders until the ball passes a certain point. There's also no force outs. You have to tag everyone to get them out. Luckily, you can easily throw a no-hitter by throwing sliders over and over. The CPU just refuses to swing at this pitch. Next is BMX Simulator. This is another top-down racer. I just couldn't get the hang of this game. It was extremely difficult to control my guy, and I kept running into stuff. The third game is Soccer Simulator. Everything in this game just feels very slippery. I feel like I never really have full control over what's going on. I actually think it's faster to slide tackle around the field than to actually run. You can't switch players either. The CPU will just select the closest player to the ball. Overall, a pretty frustrating experience. And finally, there is Pro Tennis Simulator. The ball physics in this game just feel off. The only way to properly serve the ball is when it's down by your face, which doesn't make much sense. You'll also feel lucky just to hit the ball. Quattro Sports is a mess. Thor, you lied to us all.
Quattro Sports gives me 4 great games on one cartridge. Quattro Baseball is incredible.
Let's move on to Linus Spacehead's Cosmic Crusade. You play as an alien named Linus who must prove to his buddies that he discovered the planet Earth. This is another platformer adventure game, but with more of an emphasis on platforming. The problem is the controls. Controlling Linus is a chore. You can't change direction mid-air, so once you commit to a jump, there's no correcting it. Linus sometimes just won't stop moving, making platforming extremely difficult. I gave up on this game pretty quickly. Here is another 4-in-1 cartridge. This time it's Quattro Adventure. Does it fare any better than Quattro Sports? Yes, it does. The first title is, oh boy, another Linus Spacehead game. It suffers from the same issues as Cosmic Crusade. Hard pass. Next is Super Robin Hood. This is another game from the Oliver twins, the creators of Dizzy. You play as Robin Hood, making your way through a dungeon and collecting keys and treasure. You also have a bow and arrow you can shoot to defeat enemies. It reminds me a lot of Lode Runner, which is a good thing. The third game is Boomerang Kid. This feels like an old-school arcade game. The goal is to collect boomerangs and exit as fast as possible, all while avoiding the dangers of the outback. Despite being the Boomerang Kid, you don't actually get to throw a boomerang. You also can't fall from heights, or you'll lose a life. It's not a bad game, but it's also not a very exciting one. The final game in Quattro Adventure is Treasure Island Dizzy. This is similar to Dizzy the Adventurer. You collect items to solve puzzles and get past obstacles. However, it doesn't run as smoothly. It's also more difficult because you only get one life. This is frustrating because there's a lot of gotcha traps in the game, so it's a lot of trial and error. We have reached our final game, The Fantastic Adventures of Dizzy. This is the biggest Dizzy game on the NES. It also won Best Adventure Game in Game Players magazine. Dizzy's girlfriend Daisy has once again been kidnapped and you have to rescue her. This is your standard Dizzy game. Collect items to solve puzzles and traverse obstacles. And it's much bigger than Dizzy the Adventurer. The Aladdin Deck Enhancer version of this game is slightly different than the standalone cartridge. It plays a little faster and gives you 250 stars to collect instead of 100. Overall, another fun Dizzy game. Camerica had big plans for the Aladdin Deck Enhancer. They set aside $3 million for advertising and expected the device to account for 60% of their business in 1993. Camerica planned to release more than 35 games for the device that year. Magazines like Electronic Gaming Monthly wrote up previews. Codemasters was exploring making a version of the device for the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis. On paper, the future looked bright for Camerica and the Aladdin Deck Enhancer. But the reality of the situation was much different. Internally, Camerica had major issues. Due to poor product quality, retailers got a lot of returns on Camerica products, including their joysticks and unlicensed games. Camerica's giftware division struggled due to an economic recession. Gift shops had trouble moving product, and Camerica was stuck with tons of inventory. By June of 1993, less than 5 months after the Aladdin Deck Enhancer was announced, Camerica filed for bankruptcy. It's not clear if the Aladdin Deck Enhancer ever got released. There are no known advertisements of it being for sale. If it did get out, it was a very limited release. So if the Aladdin Deck Enhancer was never released, how am I holding one right now? Well, in 1996, a store based out of New Jersey called Video Game Connections bought a ton of old Camerica inventory from a liquidator out of Brooklyn, New York. The store owner estimated there were between 5,000 and 10,000 deck enhancers, with similar quantities of each game. Over the years, even more liquidators began selling them. Listings soon popped up on eBay, and the rest is history. Even today, you can buy an Aladdin with every game brand new for about $100. The idea of the Aladdin Deck Enhancer isn't a bad one at all. Imagine if Nintendo included the standard cartridge chips within the Super Nintendo. Games would be way cheaper, since publishers would only have to manufacture the game's ROM chip. But Camerica simply didn't have the resources to launch a product like the Aladdin Deck Enhancer. The Aladdin also failed simply because it was a device for the NES. Yes, the Nintendo Entertainment System had a huge user base in 1993, but the industry was moving on to 16-bit systems. Said one former Camerica employee, "It was never going to work. We were 2 steps behind on the dance." That's all for this episode of The Gaming Historian. Thanks for watching.
Funding for Gaming Historian is provided in part by supporters on Patreon. Thank you.